Okay, so what we're going to do now is to discuss how does the company set up their risk management system. Basically, when we talk about risk management system, this ERM is one of the very famous risk management system model that is endorsed by COSO, and that's how the risk management system looks like. If you just run through this model here, I'm not sure if you realize that it's actually a model that they build onto the internal control system. Because if you go to internal control system, you notice that you will be having control environment, risk assessment, then control activity, then information system and monitoring. So you actually have one, two, three, four, five. And what they do is they build onto this system something extra. So objective, event identification plus risk response. Actually, we don't have this COSO ERM model, so I don't actually intend to discuss it with you. But my notes has a very brief, is very brief, like explaining to you what does each and every component mean. So what I intend to do is to go through with you in a more simplified manner. Now, whenever we look at risk management, hold on, let me just get this. Okay, if you want to set up a risk management system, question is what do we need? All right, so I'm going to run through the more basic things and the more important things that we need. Now, the first part that we usually need to take into account is the internal environment. Now, or you can call it the control environment for the risk management system. This is where we will be talking about issues concerning with culture. All right. Of course, that's a very important thing because that's where the attitude comes in. Okay. And once the culture is fully supportive of your risk management, then we will look at very basic component, which is risk identification, and then risk assessment and risk response. Okay, so these will be the 4 steps that we will look at when it comes to manage. Okay, I think I have a problem. I just realized that after I pause the video, it's not moving, and I really don't know when did I stop. So sorry, I just want to make sure that I don't miss anything. Now, just quickly, I was discussing about why is it important for us to manage risk. Then we talk about if we want to manage risk, there are 4 things that we need to have in our risk management system. So the internal environment, risk identification, assessment, and response. And I'm actually starting to look into the first component called internal environment, and I discussed about culture. And I'm not sure if I've touched on this, so it's okay if I have touch on this, that's fine. If not, then it's okay. I just have to tell you quickly what is this. Now, the whole idea of culture, it's about how we can have everybody to have the same kind of attitude, sharing the same kind of values and practices, and the way how we behave and our practice, our actions would characterize, would symbolize the way how we look at risk. That's our risk culture. That's why we say that there are people who are very careless. There are people who are very proactive. There are people who, when they foresee a risk going to happen, they will take action early. And so we talk about risk management culture as the beginning. So when we look at this risk culture, we will talk about risk embeddedness. So the whole thing about risk embeddedness is how we want risk awareness and risk management skills to be interwoven into the culture of the organization. So we're talking about readiness. It's the most important thing in risk management is the mindset, the readiness, it's everything. Okay, so when you are ready, you avoid firefighting, you avoid the state of panic. I was sharing just now, but I think this probably was not recorded. I was sharing about when this coronavirus outbreak first occurred in Wuhan in early January. It's actually right before Chinese New Year. We have heard of this. Uh, Myself has already started discussion with our lecturers that in the event when this outbreak go out of hand, what do we intend to do with our students? That's why I think you remember I've told you that what do we do if June exam cancel? So what will the impact be to students? The impact be to the college? The financial impact? We have discussed all that. And if you recall, we have actually been giving some so-called expectation that as we go on our classes, we've been telling you that we are considering the risk. That's why we publish our response in website. Do you remember we come up with the COVID-19 announcement? I think we put it here. Yeah, so if you see that our COVID-19 announcement was way back into as early as, where is it now? Yeah, as early as 4th of February. All right, so that means it's right after Chinese New Year. We have already taken this risk into consideration, and we have been telling students like we are getting ready, and then after a while you can see Malaysia has actually stopped having an increase in number. That's where the second outbreak comes in. So then we have these situations that we face currently. I remember one day before the announcement, we have already decided to call off all the classes just to avoid our student to be contracting the disease. Now, all these are example of how we take risk embeddedness into our ACCA team. It's like an example of showing you that because we have foreseen the risk, we have planned ahead what we're going to do, and we are ready. And because we are ready, we actually avoid the state of firefighting, we avoid state of panic. We didn't worry about what will happen to our students the moment when this thing happened. That's why you can see that the systems is all ready. That the moment we decided to call off the classes, we know exactly what to do. Now, this is just a simple example to relate to you. So if you want a business organization to be in that state, then embeddedness is important. So how do you embed risk? You need to get risk awareness That's what it says. You need to get risk awareness and risk management skill to be in the mindset of the people. What is risk awareness? Now, risk awareness is knowledge. Okay, so I think you know when people tell you you have good awareness means you have knowledge. So knowledge of what? Of risk. Knowledge of knowing that why or when risks occur. Knowledge of how to quantify risk, how to assess risk, how to manage the risk. Now, these are all example of risk awareness, and as you see, when people get serious about risk, the level of awareness increases. Now look at this pandemic situation. The very initial stage, people were not serious about it, and not much information being shared. All right. As time goes on, people get more and more serious about these risks. And you look at the activity in the WhatsApp group. You know how many times we're getting the same kind of information again and again and again and again. Now people are telling us about all sorts of things. They are telling you about how flammable your sanitizer can be. And I've seen video after video of how people demonstrate that when they light up the sanitizer with fire, they cannot see the flame, but the fire is there. Now, but you realize that what is happening, it's a way of building risk awareness, which is knowledge. They are building knowledge, all right? So the same thing applies to business. How do you create risk embeddedness is how do you build an organization where the staff are all very knowledgeable when it comes to risk. Okay, the first thing we need is a top management commitment. Now, usually it's what we call a top-down approach. An approach where you have the senior management must first agree that risk management is very important. If they agree, they will see the need of managing risk. And when they see the need of managing risk, then they will show support. How do they show support? They show support in very various ways. For example, because they support something, they will allocate budget. They will put money inside so that you're able to have the resources to manage risk. Now that's why the first thing is the top management must agree with the idea. If you don't have top managements to agree with the idea, you're gonna have problem. Now, I'll give an example. Let's just say that we're gonna go to a company and we're gonna tell them that okay, you're gonna have one day suffering problem of lockdown, all right? And when you have a lockdown, you're gonna have everybody working from home. And right now, the office do not have the capability of working from home because our information is very localized, it's all in the hard disk. So one way of moving towards the capability of working from home include example, we need to have cloud technology. You no longer want to store things inside your computer hard disk, but you want to store them in an internet server. Then number two, you can only work on home if you have what we call a virtual systems that allows this kind of collaboration. Like for instance, how you're going to do online meetings and stuff like that. Now, that is the first step. Okay, that's the first step. So to get people to come to that, you need to have bosses to buy the idea. Imagine your bosses is going to say, no lah, this is not going to happen. I don't think we are comfortable to go online. It's okay. We don't have to work from home. We can always come to office. You know, they can give lots of resistance to go against your idea. You don't have top management commitment. But when you have top management commitment, they will probably start to suggest that, oh yeah, I think what you said is good, is true, and let's prepare ourselves towards that. And how do you prepare yourself towards that? Now you need to have all kind of commitment. Now, the reason why ACCA is so ever ready with online lectures is all our lectures been using tablets and computer to teach right from day one. And we have started this effort years ago. So if we just make a comparison, like most of the MCQL programs, they don't do that. They are still very conventional, they are still on whiteboard, and that's why when this thing happened, it has caught many lecturers by surprise. And that's an example of what we call top management support. So that's the first thing. So if you want to be ever ready to deal with risk, you need the people up there to support the idea. Now, then you have to build awareness. Okay, everything will begin with knowledge. Now look at this COVID-19 pandemic. People are talking about concept of social distancing. People are talking about how the virus can spread. You know, now everybody is like COVID-19 expert. You ask them how long will the virus survive, they can tell you. You tell them, you ask them what are the symptoms when you've got infected, they will tell you. You ask them, like, when you've got infected, how long do you have to wait for the symptom to appear? They will tell you. Now, that's because this is the period where everybody gets serious about it. And because of the attitude of the seriousness, because the Prime Minister, because the King are all also serious about it, the King come out and give a message, the Prime Minister come out and give a message, everyone come out and give a message. That's the top management commitment. And because of the information that they share, that's where the awareness comes in. It's all the same, just that you're using it on a different example. So we are educating the people. Now let me just ask you, what about other virus? How much do you know? Talk about MERS. Talk about Ebola. How much do you know? See the difference? A lot other things we don't seem to know so much because we don't have that kind of awareness. Now that's why it's actually very important to have awareness. Now let me just ask you a question, okay? I mean, just imagine in the manufacturing process, you need to maintain your machine. Now can you imagine if you never maintain your machine properly? Then the machine breaks down. And of course, when machine breaks down, you're going to have production interruption. You're going to have rejects. How much loss do you think it will be? Now, of course, you can imagine that losses will be there, okay? Now, but question is, do you know each time when the production got halted, got interrupted, how much loss will the factory suffer? Now, does the staff know that whenever there's an interruption, that's the amount of loss? Does the factory worker know? Does the maintenance staff know? Or will they just take it lightly, or they will just be so ignorant and say, yeah, I know there's interruption, but it's okay, it doesn't cost as much. Now, you know, it's going to cost you a lot of money. If I share with you example of what happened in this Anna Labs that I serve as an independent director, if one of our factory line is down, simple maintenance activities, like, you know, when our machines, we got belts, you know, machines usually need belts to run. Just because you didn't maintain the belts, the cost of maintenance of the belts is very cheap. You can spend about like 2,000-3,000 to maintain it. But if the belts start to give way and have problem, each time when you have that interruption occurs, do you know our loss that we suffer can go up to few 100,000? So can you see how foolish it will be that because you never maintain the machine properly, and you will save that few thousand ringgit, you will suffer a loss of few 100,000. Now that sounds serious, right? Okay, that sounds serious. But actually, you look at it, a lot of things are the same. All right, you see, in US, medical is not cheap, it's not free. That's why when you are careless, you've got infected with COVID-19, you have to pay a few thousand US dollar just to get yourself treated. And this is the problem, awareness. So you must have awareness. How do you give awareness to your staff? How do you make staff be knowledgeable? Now, things that we've been doing, like sharing WhatsApp messages, is an example of how information get shared out, disseminated. Like companies can have intranet, they can have newsletter. A lot of people like to use role model story, and that's the reason why you have so many biographies of all the rich people that write about how they become so successful, what are their ups and downs in their life. Now, why do we want to read all these people? Because we want to follow their footsteps. We want to learn that, okay, this is what you've been through, and we want to follow your experience. Now, all that, it's about building culture. So the effects of having awareness is very simple. I give one simple example, like when workers are aware of fire risks, then naturally they will not smoke. If you are aware how serious the risk of not putting on your safety belt, then each time when you go up the car, you will insist of putting up the safety belt. Now that's awareness. Okay, so you must get people to support. You must give them the knowledge. And we must also look into the budgetary system. Now, the reason why we look at the budgetary system, we say here that to embed risk, you must have recognition within the budget, is because we need money to carry out activities. All sorts of activities, everything will cost you money. Now, it can be as simple as, for instance, a system to share information, providing training, okay, buying equipments. They all cost money. So if your budgetary systems have not catered for that, you're basically not going to have it. It's like, for example, I'm telling you, like, oh, because risk management is so important, because we have this risk, we can fall ill, we can get accident, we can't work. Okay, so what do you think we're going to do? Now, some will say, yeah, that's why insurance is very important. Okay, good. You think insurance is very important. So are you going to buy one? You say, no, I don't have money for that. Now, you are not providing resources to allow the systems to be there. That's why budgetary system is important, because it shows that you're serious about something, so that through your action, the money is to allow an action to happen. You allocated money to buy insurance. Now that's an example. Okay, that's an example. The budgetary system must reflect this. So if we tell students that, oh, you guys gotta wear masks so that you reduce the risk, but you never provide money for mask, you're not gonna do it. Okay, then to embed risk, to get people to be more aware of risk, they must have responsibility. They must recognize that it's part of their job to take into account of risk. That's why we are talking about how in your job specification you must include responsibility to address and monitor risk. And when you include responsibility to address and monitor risk, you also should appraise the staff, how well that the person has discharged this role and that will be recognized through the reward system. Now it's like I'm giving you an example. Let's say we talk about bank. Okay, now credit risk is very significant for a bank. Okay, credit risk is very significant for a bank. Let me just, okay, because we do not want to give loan to those who cannot pay back. Okay, now you know that, all right? But can you imagine if you have let's say what we call very stuck up managers that in his mind he will be saying like, who cares whether customers pay back or don't pay back, I'm gonna get my salary, right? Okay, this is not my bank, I don't own the bank, I'm just a worker. Yeah, you can have, let's say example, managers like that mindset. Okay, so how can you possibly have all the loan be approved by one single department at the headquarters? You can't. You know, you have millions of customers. So the only practical way is you will need the bank manager to take up some responsibility to approve. For example, maybe small loan. Okay, so now the bank manager can approve loans below, let's say, 100,000. But what if the bank manager he don't worry about customers not paying back because it doesn't affect him? You're gonna have big trouble. He will just simply approve loan. But now I want to make him responsible for credit risk. Okay, I want to make him responsible for credit risk. So what do you mean by making him responsible for credit risk? Now I can basically tell the bank manager that whatever loans that you approve, you will be appraised according to the recoverability of the loan, according to whether if the loan is performing or non-performing. And of course, at the end of the day, I will also be telling the bank manager that if at the end of the day, you manage to recover up to 99% of the loan you give up, you're going to get a bonus. See, that's an example of responsibility and reward. So when you give responsibility to a person, you also give reward. And that make a person think. Now, it's like, for example, I can just give money to my son and say, now, go to the supermarket and buy this. Okay? That's it. You don't have a choice. You just buy what I say. But I can also do this. I can give my son a freedom of choice and say that now I'm going to give you this amount of money and then you will go and buy this product, and I'm not going to tell you what brand I want and how much I need. Now I want you to think, why would you want to buy that, and you're praised. And I would then introduce responsibility and reward system that eventually, based on his decision, he sees that he will have to be accountable to what he has done. Now that's an example of risk responsibility, which is very important. You have to make your staff learn how to take risks. Remember, I have discussed with you about the risk thermostat, that we can use this to encourage people to take more risks or take less risks. All right. Now, we can also introduce risk-based decision making. The whole idea of risk-based decision making is, for example, you have a decision making system which allows the staff to do risk evaluation. Now, for example, I say, if you read the notes, I say if you want managers to evaluate financing option, you then need to make sure that he's able to have information about currency, about interest rates, so he has the access of information. Okay. Now, and number 6 is cultural change can also come as a result of crisis. You look at, for example, this pandemic is the best situation for all of us to really appreciate it. Um, a lot of people will always say no. They will always say that it can't be done, it cannot be possible. A lot of things is cannot. For example, we tell bosses that staff can work from home. They say, oh, cannot, you must work from office. We tell staff that you can actually do a lot of things and you can be more productive. They say cannot. You tell people that you can stay home more time and then they say cannot, I need to work. So everything is cannot, but you just look at one pandemic has changed all the things. Everything that people say cannot, and now they're doing it. And that actually help organization to realize, you know how many institutions or colleges or schools start to realize how important is online learning, a platform. And a lot of them are not prepared, but a lot of them are able to get something out of no choice. And that's a good example of how a crisis can be the best way for cultural change. But if you don't change, then you're destined to die, you see. So that's why this is an example of how we can embed risk. So the whole idea is, at the end, we just want your mindset to be more ready. That your mindset will be catered to be more responsive to risk. So that readiness is important to make sure that we avoid a firefighting situation. We avoid a state of panic. That is what we are saying. Okay. Okay. Let's just come to this page now. Page 162. Now, if you are really serious about managing risk, usually the very first thing that you have to do is the senior management, the top management, has to first decide or define their risk appetite. And what do you mean by risk appetite? Okay, risk appetite basically defines the level of risk and the type of risk that financial institution is willing to take. That an institution, okay, no finance, an institution is willing to take within its risk capacity. Now, it's the amount of risk and type of risk. Now, I've given this example in the past, so I'm going to use the same example to explain to you. Now, do you want to buy a new business, or do you want to set it up on your own? Okay, if you recall the example that I've given you before in the class is, do you want to marry a woman and start a family fresh and have your own child, or do you want to marry a woman that already has a child? That kind of example that I've given you before in the past. Now, it's very different, right? Because if you're going to buy a new business, a ready business, that everything is there, the staff is there, the machines there, the design there, everything is there, okay? Compare with if you're going to start scratch. Now, the type of risk is so different, because if you're going to start from scratch, you're going to have problems to look for a location. You don't know whether the location is proven to be effective. You don't know whether there are crowd, if customers going to come. You got to look for staff. You don't know whether you're going to get new staff. You can get the staff. You're going to have to worry about, let's say, the construction of the factory. You may have delay in the work. You got to apply license. you go through the government process of getting licensed, you know, all that is what you're going to face if you resorted to set up your own. But if you buy business, right, now you don't worry about licensing because the license is there. You don't worry about location because location is there. But you have other things to worry. You have to worry about what if the staff will not listen to you? What if you have integration problem? That the existing staff will not work well with the new staff and they start fighting. Now, that's where integration risk comes in. So, see, you have different kind of risks for those who buy business and for those who set up business. That's why you have to be very, very clear. Actually, what kind of risks are you prepared to accept? And the next question is, how much risk are you prepared to take? So, how much loss can you accommodate? Now, these are all examples of risk appetite. Now, it's never easy for a risk appetite to define in an absolute way. That's why usually when we define risk appetite, we can define them in a qualitative manner as well as quantitative manner. So, a qualitative manner is a description of risk, but does not really say how much. But quantitative is where an amount comes in. Okay, for example, I'm prepared to accept market risk, and I'm prepared to accept equity price risk. So I'm telling you that I'm alright with investing in share. Now that can be a more qualitative description of what the risks are. But I can then go further and say that when I invest, I am prepared to lose 30% of what I invest. Now, so if I start to set a boundary and say 30% of what I invest, that means if my investment is ever going to make loss, I will know exactly when I can cut my loss, or when must I sit down and reconsider my strategy. Now let me ask you a question. If you're going to start a new business, okay, you're going to start a new business. I don't care what business is that, assuming you have sorted out the risk that you want to take. My next question is, you're prepared that your business will make loss. Okay. How much loss will you take to the point that you will say that I will close down? Or are you basically saying that it doesn't matter, I will just keep on going on, I will keep going on, I will keep bearing the losses, and there is no end? Now, so that's what I'm trying to say. So that's why risk appetite is very important. You know that the risk appetite will set the boundary. Risk appetite will define for you the capacity. Okay, so without defining capacity, you may end up taking more risk than you want to take, which can be a bad thing because you allow damage to go on. Okay, now that's the first thing about risk appetite. Now I have some example about what risk appetite is by picking up from HSBC Bank. You can run through, and then this is another example of a risk appetite statement taken from WorldPay. You can read through lah. Okay, it's actually an example. Now, so generally when we tell you about risk appetite, we expect that you either set your risk appetite to be risk averse, or to be risk seeking. It basically says that there are people who take more risks, there are people who take less risks. All right, so people who take more risks, they tend to be more adventurous in their activity. They tend to, for example, be prepared to bear more losses if they're risk seeking. If they're risk averse, then they might be more rejecting risks. So probably they will not go ahead with some situations like that they are not willing to do. That's called risk averse. So let me ask you a simple question. Let's say if your business is going to have some potential compliance risks, so are you prepared to disobey the law, accept the risk that I'm prepared that if the government will ever come and catch me, probably I will cheat? Or will you be to the extent like, no, I will not do anything so that I will avoid myself being caught by the government? It's that kind of thing that I'm saying. So are you more prepared to take risks, or are you those that know you're scared, you don't take chances at all? Okay, because in all kind of things we do, you actually have to decide whether you're more risk seeking or you're more risk averse. Now, that's the general idea about risk appetite, nothing much. Okay, there's this concept called ALAP. Now, ALAP basically it's an acronym for as low as reasonably practicable. Now, the concept of ALAP is to recognize the trade-off. Okay, so there's a trade-off that we are saying. What do you mean by the trade-off? Okay, the trade-off here is, wait, let me enlarge my box. Okay, the trade-off between the amount of risk to accept versus the cost of managing the risk, the trade-off between the amount of risk to accept versus the benefit from accepting the risk. Okay, now that is the concept called ALAP. Now this is a very simple concept that it's actually very practical in our daily life. So if you look at a lot of example, then you understand what I say. Now let's try the first one. Okay, the risk and the cost of managing risk. Now if you take a commercial jet, right, a domestic commercial jet, if you go up the airplane, usually before the airplane take off, what will the stewardess do? They will explain to you the flight safety measure. Okay, and usually then they will take out a piece of yellow color jacket that they will show you and say, this is your life jacket, and say in the event of emergency you put it on, you clip, and then you pull this tag, pull that tag, there's a whistle and stuff like that. Correct? Now let me ask you a question. How likely do you think the life jacket can save your life in the event there is a crash? Now most of you, I think you will say it's unlikely, right? I always say that the good thing about the life jacket is, in the event if the plane is going to land onto sea, at least we will die with our body floating, so it's easier to locate the body. I never believe that life jacket can ever save us. But if you want to have something that is good enough to save you in the event there's a crash, what do you think is better? Parachute, right? Parachute is always better than a life jacket. But what is the problem? The problem is to put a parachute, you need a very big space. You need to train them before you can even fly the plane. Imagine a week before you fly the plane, the airline company call you and say, please come for a training. We're going to teach you how to use a parachute before you can fly the plane. Now, it's nonsense. Look at the amount of costs you need to incur to manage the risk. So why are we willing to accept the risk that the life jacket is not going to save us? Now, because we know the risk of the plane crashing is very small, and we also know the cost of life jacket is cheaper, very, very much cheaper, as opposed to the cost of a parachute. Now, that is the trade-off. We are willing to take the risk, be prepared to die, not going to have parachute, because we know the cost of parachute is so expensive that at the end of the day, if you want to fly a plane with parachute, instead of paying for 200 ringgit a ticket, you have to pay 5,000 a ticket. You say, no way, I'm not going to do that. Okay? And because you agree that the risk of the plane crashing is very low, that is allowed. As long as the risk is low enough to be reasonably practicable, you are prepared to take that risk. You're prepared to accept the way we manage the risk. That's allowed. Okay? Now, another example of how I explain ALAP to you is to look at medical treatment or medical devices. Now, you know X-ray, right? X-ray. Okay, what do you have with the risk of X-ray is radiation. Okay, radiation. You know that X-ray, the room, it's so so protected. You go into a special room, and then you have that radiologist that will wear like a protective suit, and then will go outside and cover themselves with the room, and then use a microphone and tell you, and you are actually naked. Take a deep breath. I'm going to take a photograph. Now, so you see that they are so concerned of that radiation, and yet they allow you to be exposed inside naked to take the X-ray. The radiation risk is there. And of course, you know the radiation risk can cause cancer because you can cause mutation to your cell. But you still do it. Okay? Why? Because the risk is acceptable since you don't do X-ray every day. You don't go to the hospital and say, I want to do X-ray today just because I feel like doing it. You don't do that. Okay? Now, then two, because you need to do X-ray in order for us to see what's going on inside, then we can do further procedure, which is important to save you. And three is the cost. Now, you know, if you find X-ray is very dangerous, what can be a safer option is you do MRI. But MRI is very expensive. It's about 15 times the cost of X-ray. So if you do X-ray, it costs you 100 ringgit. MRI can cost you 1,500. So if you just fall off your chair, you just want to know whether you fractured your bone, you can do MRI if you want, which is safer. But you can do X-ray, which is a fraction of the cost. Which one will you do? Now, that's an example of the second way of how ALAP is. That we accept the risk as a trade-off to the benefits that we're going to derive from the risk. Now, it's the same idea when we add chlorine to water. Chlorine is very toxic. A bit of chlorine that you take can kill you. But we add chlorine not to contaminate the water. No. We add chlorine to purify the water because chlorine is said to be able to kill the germs. But when you take a lot of water, I mean, you take the water with a lot of chlorine over a prolonged period, it damages your kidney. But again, why are we doing that? Because we see there's a trade-off between the risk that we take and the benefit. Now that is ALAP. So the concept of ALAP is important because ALAP deals with the risk that we're going to take. Now that is the first stage. So in risk management, we have to talk about our control environment. So when we discuss control environment, we talk about how we embed risk, and then we discuss about defining our risk appetite. Then we discuss the concept called ALAP. Okay, so we will now enter the second stage of risk management, which is to identify risk. Now, we can use a very small business to start with, all the way to a much bigger business. And we can start imagining from the point that if you're going to set up a new business, so even before you begin, how do you know what risk that you're going to face? Okay, so let's ask this question, all right, that risk identification. Now, how do I know the risk my business is facing or exposed to? How do you know? And of course, you should be thinking about your risk actually even before you start your business, so you become more prepared. If not, you may end up with firefighting, because you may end up starting business and then when the risk truly occurs, you do not know what to do. So think about, if you're going to start a business, how do you know what risk that you're going to face? Now, some people will say my common sense, because of my experience, because of what I know, because of what I've read, because what I've heard, and all that tells me about, you know, when I start a business, these are my risks. Well, but you must recognize that not everybody has the same kind of common sense. That's why there are good businessmen, there are lousy businessmen. There are people who start business and then they just close down right after a while. Well, that's because they don't have common sense. Common sense is actually not so common. Common sense requires a lot of reading, a lot of exposure. Now, but the more experienced you are, the better you are when it comes to identifying risk. But how do you increase this kind of experience? Now, one way is don't rely on your own experience, but to rely on more people's experience so that you can brainstorm together. Okay, so one way is you can have like a brainstorming session with many people sharing their common sense, sharing their experience. So if you get a few people to sit down and say, hey, you know, I'm gonna do this, just do an experiment and tell your parents, hey, you know, I'm gonna start this business, and what do you think? Just ask your parents, your brother, sister, and sit down on the table and say that, hey, I'm gonna start this business, what do you think? Look at what kind of questions that they're gonna throw to you, including things that you may not have taken into account. So that's an example of how we can identify risk through sharing of experience. Okay, Now, and what if you don't have people to share with? You can attend conference, a lot of what we call the business conferences, analyst conferences. They are actually a very good way of for experts to come and share with you. Okay, look at, for example, like this kind of economic situation. How do you think that Brexit will cause an impact to the economy? To what extent that this lockdown will affect the economy? You know, all these are the example of things that we will not be able to comprehend. So we actually need to listen to a lot more people. Okay, now that's an example of going for conferences, going for seminars and listens to the view of the people. Now, of course, as then when you have started business, you will know more risks as you moved on because the risks start occurring. So you start to face your problem, and when you actually face the problem, each time you face the problem, you realize that the risk is there. You know, like for example, Singapore is much better prepared now in this COVID-19 because they suffered through SARS. But Malaysia did not suffer through SARS. Back then, SARS was a major problem to Singaporeans and Hong Kong, but not Malaysia. And because of what Singapore been through, they are more prepared now. So that's an example of how they learn through their own experience. So through their past incident. Okay, that you can have your past experience to tell you that this is what you're going to suffer if the same thing is going to happen again. Now, of course, you can have so many things of like having workshops with your staff, having survey. From the survey, you can listen to what do they think. You can have simulations, or we call scenario planning. It's like answering a lot of what if. What if Donald Trump is to lose this election? What will happen? What if Donald Trump is to win the election? What if this new government will not stay after 2 months? What if this new government is to stay? What if this new government is to stay and then the next election that the Pakatan will win again? Or what if they will lose again? Now, what if this lockdown or control movement order is to extend beyond 14th of April? What if it's going to go on until end of June? Now that's an example of scenario planning. So you're going to give yourself an example of if things like that is going to happen, then what we're going to do. Okay. Now you got to understand that most businesses, because it's ongoing, okay, they're ongoing. Now it's like the business was there in year, let's say 2000 they started, all right, 2000 they started, and now the business is already in year 2020. So for the past 20 years, they must have been through a lot, all right, they must have been through a lot. They must have encountered a lot of problems in the business. They must have gone through a lot of risks. So that 20 years would have equipped them through their own experience. Okay, so that 20 years would have equipped them with their own experience, that they now know more about what risks that their business is going to face. Now that's why we believe that in that 20 years of doing business, you would have your own experience. Okay, you would have your own experiences about the risks that you've been through. All right, Okay, the question is, do we have a way that we can be more systematic in dealing with our own risk? That over the past 20 years, you have a system of recording the risks that you have been through, so that we're talking about business, so that every time when you have a new staff coming in and then the staff resign, another one comes in, with that kind of situations where there's changeover in the staff, people will actually be able to know that these are all the risks that they've been through and how they will be ready. Now, what do we do? That's why in business we talk about documentation. That how do we record our risk? Okay. Now, the approach we use is called having a risk register. That's why, of course, you normally don't see this kind of thing in small businesses, but the bigger companies you do. If you go to the big ones, you actually can see that they have risk registers being prepared. Okay. Now, so the risk registers is going to be a document that they record all the risks of their businesses. And you notice that when they record the risks of their businesses, they will update as they go, because risks change every now and then. So one way for existing businesses to identify the risk of their business is they can do risk audit. All right, they can do risk audit. They can go through their record and update the record and see whether if there's any changes to their risk. Now, this is a process of identifying risk, and you can look at your notes in page 168 to look at what is risk audit, and your notes in page 169 about what is this thing called risk register. Can I bring you to the notes now? Just go to page 168. Okay, now, okay, risk audit is basically defined as a systematic way to understand the risk of the organization. Who can do a risk audit? Well, it's really up to you. You can have your own people to do it. You can outsource it to a consultant, a risk auditor. It doesn't matter whether it's done by your own people or done by people outside. So I have some notes about why is it better to get people inside to do it, people outside to do it. Normally, we argue that an external risk audit is more objective, because the people coming in to assess the risk is people outside. And because they are more objective, they normally will give investors greater sense of confidence. They will feel that the risks are properly addressed, okay? And of course, when you get people outside to come and look at your risk, they have an advantage that they can see things from a fresh pair of eyes. What we are saying is, you can avoid problem that you get used to your own limitation, or you get used to your own problem. A very typical example is, every house got this a spoiled toilet. I've seen so many places that they either have problem with their flush or problem with their tap. That kind of thing is so common. All right, probably your house now is having a toilet that has a problematic flush. It's spoiled and you're supposed to change it, but you realize that people usually don't change it until they get used to the problem and they live with the problem, until they don't see the problem as a problem. Now that's the kind of issues that we always tends to have lor. So that's when you start to tolerate your risk. All right, you start to tolerate your risk. Now these are the issues that we are saying, the problem that why it's important to see risk from a fresh pair of eyes. Okay, so that is the good thing of doing external risk audit. And of course, when you get people outside to come in, you also have the advantage of them being an expert to teach you the best practice, the current development, so the knowledge transfer may be there. Okay, now the important is I just want to tell you actually what is a risk audit. Now risk audit is basically getting somebody to come in to tell you what are the risks. They identify the risk for you. Now they don't just identify risk for you, they assess the risk for you. So they will normally measure your risk against two variables, the probability that the risk will occur and the impact that if the risk do occur. Then the risk auditor will do a review of your existing control, analyze your existing control and see how well prepared are you concerning the risk. So if in the event that these risks do occur, what can you do? How do you respond? And of course that at the end of the risk audit, then the risk auditor will come up with a report, where in the report the risk auditor will usually give you an elaborations like is there anything you need to improve, or do you think that everything is okay? Now that is risk audit, which is one of those process that companies can do every now and then to understand their risk better. Okay, it's not going to be a simple exercise because the risk auditor will actually have to go through all department, observe, do interview with the staff, carry out survey, then only can come up with a report on what kind of risk. And normally the risk auditor will also take the old or the existing risk register to run through. And as the risk auditor run through the existing risk registers, then the risk auditor will actually consider if these if these risk registers have to be updated. So what do you imagine in the risk register? Now if you just go on to next page, right? Risk register usually is a book. I mean nowadays we don't use a book, but usually it's a very long book. You know those days when we have our ledger book, the big size one, so that's how risk registers looks like in the past. It's a table that will have all these information. So in the risk register, you normally have a risk number. A risk number is basically like the code, okay, a code. The reason why we need to give a risk a code is because when you want to communicate with anyone, it's actually easier. Now I just give you an example. You drive a car and suddenly you have some sensation with the car. You feel that the car has some vibration and some strange noise. You're going to call the mechanic and describe to the mechanic what is wrong with the car. How easy do you think you can do that? And how likely do you think the mechanic will actually know what is wrong with the car? That's why the mechanic usually will say that I can't tell you what's wrong, but I will test drive it myself. And most of the time when the mechanic test drive the car, the problem is not there, and then you had the problem that the mechanic can't solve because they don't actually know the problem. Now, that's why the more modern car, they have this computer that can record a code whenever that the car has an issue. That's why when you send your car to the mechanic, they usually don't depend so much on your description. Well, they still do because they still want to use what you say to basically confirm that the problem is true. but they depends on the code. Now that's why the code is important, because it's hard for us to elaborate the problem. That's why we have a code, that we use the code to communicate. Now then in the risk registers, you have to define what type of risk that it is. You know, when we talk about market risk, liquidity risk, like is it a liquidity risk, is it a health and safety risk? Now that's what it means by the type of risk. Now author basically refers to the person who detected the risk, and it's actually important to know the risk author, because if you want to really understand more about the risk, you normally has to go back to the original person. So that's why we have a risk author. Now, and we normally will record when was the risk being identified and when was the risk last updated. Now this is actually a very important information, because you see usually we know risk change now and then. So if there is a long gap, imagine if the risk was identified on the 17th of April 2014, and then it was last updated on 1st of June 2017, and today is 2020. So what happened from 2017 to 2020? Now that may give us a suggestion that the risk could have been outdated. It's time that we need to review the risk again. That's why this is a very important information that we must have. Now then a description of the risk is basically just tells us more about the risk, and then the likelihood, the chance that the risk will occur, the impact. Now risk owner is the person in charge, so who will be responsible to deal with the risk. And risk status and risk action status is basically telling us the progress. This is usually when you have risk that it may take a long time for the risk to be managed. Take example, like let's say we want to have a project on flood mitigation. Okay. Now you probably will start work in 2019, and you expect that this thing will only finish in 2022. Because it's a mega project, it takes a long period of time. So what is the status now? Are we on time, behind time, or what? Okay. Now, and in all these information that we have here, there is this thing called interdependency with other risks. And what we are trying to say here is risk correlation. Okay. Now, we call this as risk relatedness correlation. Okay. Risk relatedness refers to the relationship. Now let me just explain it in this way. Okay. Related risks are two risks that are capable of influencing each other. That's called related. So when two risks are related, we know that they are capable of influencing each other. While correlation is to measure how one risk can influence the other. Example, will it cause the risk to go up or go down? Now that is risk correlation. Okay, now and we know that there are two types. Actually we said this before. A positively correlated risk and negatively correlated risk. What's the difference? Okay, if positive, we are basically saying risk A up, risk B also up. Now, negative means risk A up, risk B goes down. Okay, and this is actually a very important thing to do risk management. If you remember, like for example, I think we shared with this before, that if you look at Petronas, now Petronas has very significant environmental risks. The reason why they have very significant environmental risks is because whatever that they're doing in their business causes a lot of harm to the environment. And when environmental risk goes up, you know that reputation risk goes up. And there is nothing we can do, because there is nothing Petronas can do to reduce its environmental risk, in the sense like the nature of their business is such that they are doing oil and gas. But Petronas can do a lot more to manage their reputation risk, so that the impression of this business to the people is not so bad. And if you remember, I think we have said this before in the class. What is your impression about Petronas? And most of you say that it appears as a good company. And that's because they've been doing a lot of activities. Like you remember the reef ball project that I've shown you before in Similajau, alright, so that is the place that they go and do conservation effort. Now that's example of how they deal with reputation risk. Now this is the whole idea of risk correlation, is to tell us how the risk will behave one to another. Okay, now this explains the process of risk identification. Okay, now once your risk has been identified, the next thing you got to do is to assess it. So assessment is for us to quantify our risk, and the quantification of risk will take into account a couple of things. One is to understand that environment can change. So we look at whether you have a static environment versus a dynamic environment. And two is, how do we do assessment when they are objective or subjectively assessed. And here is where we will learn something called a heat map, which is a way of how our risk is being recorded. Okay, so let's go back to your notes and look at risk assessment. Okay, now risk assessment is basically the process of how we quantify our risk. And to look at the risk quantification, we will come to that later. Okay, to look at the risk quantification, we can see that risk can be measured through two ways. One is the impact of the risk and also the likelihood of the risk. Okay, I think I'll just write here. Okay, so that it's easier. So risk assessment is the process of quantifying risk into, now two things that we will do. The impact and the likelihood. Likelihood is the chance of probability that risk will materialize, that risk will occur. Impact is the consequences consequences, which can be financial and non-financial, when risks do occur. Now, of course, when we want to assess risk, we always like to ask the questions like, how often do we assess risk? Okay. Now, I'm just going to give very simple questions for you to think about this. All right. You know, we need to do medical checkup every now and then, so that we can know our health reading. Okay. Whether I just can't. Okay. Why is it so hard for me to? Okay. Now, how often do we assess risk? How often do you think you need to do a medical checkup? How often to do a medical checkup? How often do you think we have to do a blood test? All right. Now, of course, some of you will straight away say that it depends. Okay. Depends on example like your age. Of course, you know that young people probably will do once every 5 years. When you come to like my age, you probably have to do once every 2 years or 1 year. You know, my mom do blood tests once every 3 months. Okay. So the reason is because as we age, our engine in our body deteriorates, so the things will change quite fast. So that's why the frequency of doing a blood test or risk assessment has to be up. Now, this is the same concept that we explained to you. How often do you need to assess risk? Now, the answer is the environment that you're in static, or is the environment that you're in dynamic? Because if your environment is static, it does not change much, then we actually don't have to do so often. But if it's dynamic, then of course you have to do it very often. Okay. Not only that, the dynamic of the environment tells us about how often we assess risk, it also tells us the requirement of our risk system. Okay. Now, like when things are dynamic, we need a more complex risk management system. For example, a monitoring system. Okay, I give you an example. The same situation like medical. You know, when you are in ICU, what's the difference when you stay in ICU and you're not in ICU is when you're in ICU, the kind of equipment that they will fix to your body is so much more advanced that they have like continuous reading, like your heartbeats, your blood pressure, your breathing. You know, they do that kind of continuous monitoring that even the slightest change will set off the alarm. Now, that's because your condition is so dynamic that it can deteriorate so fast. You see the idea now? That's why the dynamic system, the dynamic environment also requires a more complex systems of monitoring, so that we will be able to cope up with the risk. Now, I think that's quite easy. So that tells us about whether the environment is dynamic or static. And then we understand that if the risk change, okay, once risk has changed, we must respond to it by changing the way we manage it. For example, if risks become more significant, okay. Now, take example. If if you are operating in an area that there's never been flood in the past 50 years. You probably will not even be bothered to insure yourself against flood risk. Okay, but let's say recently with the development nearby, the irrigation system is bad, the drainage is bad, and there has been a few times that minor flood occurs. Now, you see that? Because of that, you see that the flood risk has changed. So you will start to ask yourself, maybe I should insure myself against flood risk. Now, this diagram is basically telling us that how risk may be here, come to here, or how risk could be here, come to here. Now, so we respond to the way we manage the risk so that one, the cost of managing risk must be well maintained, and two, we also look at the effectiveness of your risk management. Because if you don't respond to the change in the risk, your risk management strategy may not be effective. Now, that is the first part, to understand whether your risk environment is dynamic or static. Then the second thing that we see here is about objective and subjective assessment. What do you mean by objective or subjective assessment? Now, objective assessment is when you can measure it with scientific accuracy. That's it, okay? Meaning you can back them with statistics. All right, you can back them with data. Now that's called scientific accuracy. Now, like for example, if I ask you, let's say you're standing in front of your house and I ask you, what do you think that the weather is like later on? Will there be rain? Will there be rain tomorrow? You know, how accurate can you tell me if there's going to be a rain by just looking at the sky? Now, I believe whatever you're going to say will not be scientific. It's probably your wild guess with some of your common sense by looking at the cloud, whether it's dark or not dark, to tell me, yeah, it's going to rain. That's all you probably can do, okay? But I would say that the risk is more accurately assessed, or we say objectively assessed, if you have the tool, like you have the satellite image looking at the cloud, you calculate or you measure the wind speed, and then how the cloud will move, and then whether the rain will come. Now that is objectively assessed. Look at this COVID-19 pandemic. What is the chance that when someone got infected, they will die? I believe they have given us this percentage initially. They say that the chance of someone dying of this is about 2%. But now if you see the death rate, like in Italy, it's about 5% to 8%. And now they are able to say that it depends on various factors. They say it depends on your age. It depends on whether do you have any chronic disease with you. That means, are you healthy or you already have heart problem, high blood pressure? And they also say it depends on whether the healthcare system is it overwhelmed or not. Meaning if your healthcare is overwhelmed with a lot of people, like in Italy now, they say they have to leave to let people die. Now, so you see, I'm able to give you numbers to substantiate what I think. It's not that I'm God that I can tell who is going to die, but at least the figures give us some indication that that is the rate. Now, this is what we call something that is objectively assessed. Okay. Now, I'm going to use some space here. Okay. What is harder to predict or to assess? All right. Is it impact or is it likelihood? Think. Is it more difficult to assess the impact, or is it more difficult to assess the likelihood? All right, which one is more difficult? Now, I think that impact is actually easier to assess than likelihood. Now, it's like I'm going to ask you, okay, what is the risk that there will be a flood occurring in MCKL? And then number two, if there is a flood, how much will the damage be? Now, I find that the first one is harder to predict, but the second one is easier, because if there is a flood, I can tell you that how much loss we're going to suffer. We're going to change some of the furniture, and how much will that be? We're going to replace some of the flooring. How much will that be? You know, I can give you the amount quite easily, but the chance is quite difficult. Okay, now, so I hope you can see when we talk about assessment what it means by something that can be objectively assessed and subjectively assessed. So objectively assessed means we have scientific accuracy. Now, talk about subjective assessment. So can you come to page 174? Okay. Now, if you think that the risk is very subjective, okay, that's what we're saying. That if risk is subjective, all right, if risk is subjective, then how do we assess it? Now, it's like I'm going to ask you an example. In 2018 and 2019, everyone is predicting if there is a major crash or recession to the economy. Okay, let me tell you the background. In 1997, there's a crash in the economy, but 1998 it's a worse crash. Let's see. Now, 1997 and 1998, there was this Asian financial crisis. 97 was not so bad, okay? 98 was worse. You can see in 1997, all right, this was the peak, okay? This was the peak. Then 1997, it crashed, but it went really, really down in 1998. Now, in 2007, there was a peak, okay? And 2008 is where they go down really, really bad. And everybody has been saying that after 10 years, there's always a fall. So will there be a fall in 2007? No, there was not a fall. And will there be a fall in 2017, 2018? There was no fall as well. And in fact, people are predicting that what about 2019? So everybody is predicting, and it seems like nothing ever happened. And I tell you, no one has actually accurately predicted that 2020 is the fall that is caused by a pandemic. Okay. me see if I can search this. Now, this is what happened in 2000. If you see the news, it was in 2019. All right, it was written in July 2019, and at that time, people are still predicting what could be the cause of the collapse of the economy. And one of the theory that people suggested is Deutsche Bank could crash, the one in German, all right, Deutsche Bank could crash. And because Deutsche Bank is such a big bank, that the crash in Deutsche Bank can trigger the crash in the global economy. And if you read the headline, they say it could trigger another global financial crisis. And I'm showing you example of what happened in 2019, July. It's not really long ago, right? Because nobody actually foresee that this thing is caused by a virus. So you see, the thing is, everyone is trying to predict that there will be a crash. Let's see. Now, this is the year 2017. Let me find 2018. See, in 2018, December, people are asking, are you ready for a financial crisis in 2019? And you just see that things are getting better and better in the US. And people are actually not expecting that the crisis is going to come. And in fact, I think let me see. Okay, I can't find the news because, in fact, the Star wrote in 31st December 2019. Let me see if I can find. Yeah, okay, I think this is the article. Okay, 2020. Now, if you read this on 1st January, you will have a complete feeling of what is happening right now. And look at how people just can't predict what is happening. And look at this. They say that from the economic perspective, we survived the Asian financial crisis 1997, global financial crisis 2008, thanks to Bank Negara, which is resilient. And then they are talking about what will happen in the economy. And they say that the economy is expected to grow at a slightly faster pace of 4.8% in 2020 from the 4.7% projected in 2019, despite that there was a trade war. And everybody is predicting that trade war can lead to economic crisis. See, there's a lot of questions are being put up and say that the trade war is the cause of the economic crisis, and people are actually predicting that trade war is the cause. You know, there's lots of articles. See, was in November 2019, that the escalation of the China and US trade war could be the reason that lead to economic crisis. But is that true? No. All that are not true. Nobody has predicted that the economy crash is caused by something called virus. Okay? Except Bill Gates. If you look at it, Bill Gates is the guy who actually predicted that this virus could be a problem, because he actually gave in a TED Talks. I think yeah, I think this is the one. It's actually quite interesting, you know, because this video was recorded in 2015. Since we are playing this at home, I thought of maybe we can just have a watch of this.
When I was a kid, the disaster we worried about most was a nuclear war. That's why we had a barrel like this down in our basement filled with cans of food and water. When the nuclear attack came, we were supposed to go downstairs, hunker down, and eat out of that barrel. Today, the greatest risk of global catastrophe doesn't look like this. Instead, it looks like this. If anything kills over 10 million people in the next few decades, it's most likely to be a highly infectious virus rather than a war. Not missiles, but microbes. Now, part of the reason for this is that we have invested a huge amount in nuclear deterrence, but we've actually invested very little in a system to stop an epidemic. We're not ready for the next epidemic. Let's look at Ebola. I'm sure all of you read about it in the newspaper. Lots of tough challenges. I followed it carefully through the case analysis tools we use to track polio eradication. And as you look at what went on, the problem wasn't that there was a system that didn't work well enough. The problem was that we didn't have a system at all. In fact, there are some pretty obvious key missing pieces. We didn't have a group of epidemiologists ready to go who would have gone, seen what the disease was, see how far it had spread. The case reports came in on paper. It was very delayed before they were put online, and they were extremely inaccurate. We didn't have a medical team ready to go. We didn't have a way of preparing people. Now, Médecins Sans Frontières did a great job orchestrating volunteers, but even so, we were far slower than we should have been getting the thousands of workers into these countries. And a large epidemic would require us to have hundreds of thousands of workers. There was no one there to look at treatment approaches, no one to look at the diagnostics, no one to figure out what tools should be used. As an example, we could have taken the blood of survivors, processed it, and put that plasma back in people to protect them. But that was never tried. So there was a lot that was missing, and these things are really a global failure. The WHO is funded to monitor epidemics, but not to do these things I talked about. Now in the movies, it's quite different. There's a group of handsome epidemiologists ready to go. They move in, they save the day, but that's just pure Hollywood. The failure to prepare could allow the next epidemic to be dramatically more devastating than Ebola. Let's look at the progression of Ebola over this year. About 10,000 people died, and nearly all were in the 3 West African countries. There's 3 reasons why it didn't spread more. The first is there was a lot of heroic work by the health workers. They found the people and they prevented more infections. The second is the nature of the virus. Ebola does not spread through the air. And by the time you're contagious, most people are so sick that they're bedridden. Third, it didn't get into many urban areas, and that was just luck. If it had gotten into a lot more urban areas, the case numbers would have been much larger. So next time we might not be so lucky. You can have a virus where people feel well enough while they're infectious that they get on a plane or they go to a market. The source of the virus could be a natural epidemic like Ebola, or it could be bioterrorism. And so there are things that would literally make things 1,000 times worse. In fact, let's look at a model of a virus spread through the air like the Spanish flu back in 1918. So here's what would happen. It would spread throughout the world very, very quickly. And you can see there's over 30 million people die from that epidemic. So this is a serious problem. We should be concerned. But in fact, we can build a really good response system. We have the benefits of all the science and technology that we talk about here. We've got cell phones to get information from the public and get information out to them. We have satellite maps where we can see where people are and where they're moving. We have advances in biology that should dramatically change the turnaround time to look at a pathogen and be able to make drugs and vaccines that fit for that pathogen. So we can have tools, but those tools need to be put into an overall global health system, and we need preparedness. The best lessons, I think, on how to get prepared are, again, what we do for war. For soldiers, we have full-time waiting to go. We have reserves that can scale us up to large numbers. NATO has a mobile unit that can deploy very rapidly. NATO does a lot of war games to check, are people well trained? Do they understand about fuel and logistics and the same radio frequencies? So they are absolutely ready to go. So those are the kinds of things we need to deal with an epidemic. What are the key pieces? First is we need strong health systems in poor countries. That's where mothers can give birth safely, kids can get all their vaccines, but also where we'll see the outbreak very early on. We need a medical reserve corps. Lots of people who've got the training and background who are ready to go with the expertise. And then we need to pair those medical people with the military, taking advantage of the military's ability to move fast, do logistics, and secure areas. We need to do simulations, germ games, not war games, so that we see where the holes are. The last time a germ game was done in the United States was back in 2001, and it didn't go so well. So far, the score is germs 1, people 0. Finally, we need lots of advanced R&D in areas of vaccines and diagnostics. There are some big breakthroughs, like adeno-associated virus, that could work very, very quickly. Now, I don't have an exact budget for what this would cost, but I'm quite sure it's very modest compared to the potential harm. The World Bank estimates that if we have a worldwide flu epidemic, global wealth will go down by over $3 trillion, and we'd have millions and millions of deaths. These investments offer significant benefits beyond just being ready for the epidemic. The primary health care, the R&D, those things would reduce global health equity and make the world more just as well as more safe. So I think this should absolutely be a priority. There's no need to panic. We don't have to hoard cans of spaghetti or go down into the basement. But we need to get going because time is not on our side. In fact, if there's one positive thing that can come out of the Ebola epidemic, It's that it can serve as a early warning, a wake-up call to get ready. If we start now, we can be ready for the next epidemic. Thank you.
Right. Yeah, that's Bill Gates talking. So I'm thinking that since we can listen to a really wise guy and such a rich man, so no harm to just spend 8 minutes listening to him. I think you can listen to things that he said, which is things that we've learned, like running simulation. It's a way of how we can identify risk and how we can actually assess risk. And he said that a global epidemic can wipe off about 3 trillion out of the world economy. Actually, if you look at the loss alone in US, this is just in 2000, February 25th. You know, February 25th is like a few weeks ago. You know? And it's not even based on currently. They have already said they have wiped off 1.737 trillion. And that is like few days ago. I mean, like few weeks ago. So let's see if I can get something more recent. I think that's more recent. COVID-19 pandemic and wiped off 7 trillion global equity markets. Much higher than what Bill Gates actually suggested. And look at how Bill Gates has foreseen that the risk is coming in 2015. And that's why that video has actually been making rounds when COVID-19 occurred, to say that probably Bill Gates is giving us a hint that there is a bioterrorism, but I really don't think so, all right? Because this is not something that is new. In fact, we have been through many cycles of pandemic, but apparently that each time when we go through, we just tends to forget it, and then we don't seem to learn from this. So that's why we are not so prepared. Okay, so back to all these things that I've been discussing with you. The whole idea why we are looking into all this is to show you that, you know, this is the difficult thing when it comes to risk assessment. It's very hard for people to actually predict the chance that things is going to happen. And even when you get the best of the experts to sit down and to predict, they will still come and tell you that things is going to be so much worse and stuff like that. Okay, so all this is the difficult thing. All right, and I personally feel that the recovery of this crash can be quite fast. That's my assessment. Okay, I find that the recovery can be quite fast. I find that the recovery will happen as soon as this COVID-19 is to put to rest. So that's my take. All right, and because of that, I still stay invested. I try to buy into the stocks now. Of course, whatever that I bought in previously, obviously I've made loss when the capital market value has dropped. But I don't have an issue, because I find that even though all these things are there, but the fundamental of business stay, and as long as the fundamental of business stay, it's only a paper loss to me. But I predict that the recovery can be fast. That's my assessment. Okay. Now, so how do you do assessment if it's so subjective. Now, one of the way of what people do is through a risk assessment survey. And what they do in a risk assessment survey, it's basically they will list down the various kind of risks, and they will ask various people to give their assessment or their scope. That is like we're asking you the risk that changes in regulation that can result in increased competitive pressure and affects your ability to conduct business. So do you think that the change in the law can be so substantial that it affects your business going concern? That's what they're asking. Now, what do you think about the impact? Rate 1 to 10. What do you think about the likelihood? Rate 1 to 5. So what we'll do is we try to then tabulate the results of the survey and look at what generally people say. Now, and it's important that the risk assessment survey has to be done with the right group of people, because if you're going to ask people who doesn't know stuff, they are not well informed, they will give you their response through their wild guess, and wild guess will never be objective. Okay, so the objective assessment requires knowledge. Now, but that is an example of how we will carry out a risk assessment survey. Okay, so once you've got your risk assessed, then what is important is to put it up in a diagram so that you can look at your risk portfolio. The most typical way of looking at our risk is through a risk map that we normally put it into 4 quadrants: the impact and the likelihood. So we generally say that there are risks that is low impact, low likelihood, high impact, high likelihood, and vice versa. Okay. Now, but this kind of risk assessment, the way you tabulate the risk, will not be very helpful. It is like I'm telling you that risk A is high impact, high likelihood. Risk B is high impact, high likelihood. Now, you probably thought that they are equally significant, but maybe risk A is here, but risk B is here. So the position in the risk map will give us a better understanding of how significant the risk can be. And normally in real life, we don't just draw a risk map with just 4 quadrants. This is usually what we use in study to give you an understanding. In real life, the risk map is done in this way. So we will position all our risks. And you know, when you position all your risks, you then will see how much of your risks are categorized at which level. So if you're going to have a very risky business, for example, like if you're going to end up having, let's say, all these are the risks, okay? Now, I'll be very, very concerned when I have a business that the risks are concentrated in this way. See that? I'll be thinking, wow, that means my business is having so much risk and they are all so significant. Now, that's why when you have a business with that kind of risk portfolio, it's actually kind of risky. But if you have a business that, let's say, your risks are all concentrated here, now then it will not be so bad, right? Okay. Then of course the risk map is important, or we call this a heat map, is important to give us a reflection as in how well that you've been managing your risk. Are you taking care of your risk properly? So like this current pandemic, my personal observation is there are people who are not prepared for this kind of lockdown. That's why things are really bad. So for those who are not prepared, they are really caught off guard, and you can see lots of business will go down, lots of people will lose job. And there are people who are more prepared, and there are people who are basically able to sail through the crisis. And of course, when you sail through the crisis, you will come back stronger. All right. Now that is why risk management is very important. Okay. So that is why in our life we always talk about how we manage our risk. That's why you gotta ask yourself, like, in the event if your income is gonna cut off, how long can you survive? How long can you sustain? On what basis? If you need an urgent funds, do you have people or sources that you can go to, that you can borrow that money? Can you raise fund? Can you sell assets? These are all examples of how you manage your personal risk. You have to think about that. And that's because you're studying. If you study all these things and you don't put them into practice, it is a shame on us that we don't do what we learn. And it's worse that we don't do what we teach other people to do. So we have to be a testimony of what we are. So we have to manage it properly. Okay. Now, so coming to the last thing of the risk management system. So we have learned about how we assess risk. So now we're going to see the issue on knowing the risk that we've assessed. How do you respond to the risk? Now, this is what we usually call in the exam. They call this as TARA, not HARA, TARA. And the word TARA actually comes from the acronym of risk transfer, then risk acceptance, reduction, and avoidance. That's TARA. Okay. Now, what do you mean by risk acceptance? Okay, maybe I will start from risk transfer. Okay. Now, risk transfer or sharing is to transfer or share the risk impact to a third party. Okay. How do you share your risk impact? For example, you buy insurance, you do a joint venture. That means you do a partnership. All right, so you share the risk. That's called risk transfer. Now, risk acceptance, on the other hand, is, since they say accept, right? That means we will accept the risk. And when we say we accept the risk, that means we will accept the consequences when the risk materializes. Now, why accept risk? Now, normally you accept risk because the risk is clearly insignificant. The risk is very small to you. Okay. Now, another reason that why we accept risk is because we find that we cannot manage or we cannot control it. Now, either because it's too expensive or you have lack of skills. Okay. Now that's acceptance. All right. Now, what is a risk reduction strategy? Risk reduction or risk minimization is basically how we want to reduce the probability of risk occurrence. So it's to cut down the percentage. Example is through internal control to reduce the risk, and risk avoidance is to disengage from the activity that gives rise to the risk. So you avoid it. All right. Now we avoid risk that either we have no appetite for it. Okay. So you totally do not want the risk at all. So you avoid it. Okay. Now, example, maybe because it's against your objective. Okay. Now, like for instance, from day one, anyone who knows me they always hear that I never will buy shares in companies like Genting because first, the ethical value is something that I'm very concerned. I don't want to invest in the business to do with gambling because I think that gambling itself is a very wrong thing. So I don't want to make money through gambling. I think that's against my personal value. I think that's against the value of God. So to me, that's very important. So a few times people been coming to me and say, hey, Genting Highland is so cheap. You know, why don't you buy the share? You know, gambling is sure money. Now, yes, you can say all that, but it's never within my risk appetite. So I will just never touch it. That's it. So that's my reasoning. Okay. Now we should avoid risk that is very significant as well because it's not wise for you to expose yourself to the risk. Now this is a meaning called Tara. So usually one of the main thing that we take into account into how we manage risk is to look at the impact and the likelihood. So if I come back to this risk map again, usually we will suggest to people that anything that the risk is impact low, likelihood low, we can accept. And anything that the impact and likelihood high, we should avoid. And when the impact is high, we should transfer the risk so that the risk impact go down. If the likelihood is high, we should reduce the risk so that the likelihood will go down. And that's how Tara comes into the picture. Okay, and it's not the only way of how risk is being managed. No, it doesn't work that way. So we don't do business like that in a very mechanistic way. But it's a good guidance to tell us that that's what you do. Okay, now with that, I finish with you the overall understanding of how we do risk management. Okay, now risk management, it's a very important business wisdom because at the end of the day when you do business or anything you do in life, if you don't manage your risk properly, you will be caught in firefighting. And that's why at the end of the day, it all starts with our culture. Now look back into Bill Gates' video that he gave in the TED Talks. He said that the only way that we can act on a global pandemic is when every country's leader must come and work together. And they have to agree and they have to see that this is a serious problem. If you can spend so much money in warfare, nuclear mitigation, producing weapons, why are we not spending enough in this side of the thing? Well, that's because we never see that as something so important. That's why it takes us to go through every crisis to grow and become more mature. Now that gives you a good idea. I think you live in a very good time to appreciate all these concepts because you see so much in such a short time. Okay, whatever that we are doing and we are going through now is unprecedented. A lot of things has never happened, not in my life. Okay, but we are all going through it together. That's the first thing, the mindset. So the takeaway of our lesson is not just for our study, but it's for our life. How do we manage risk in our life? Start with the mindset. Then know that the risks are there. Then tell yourself how significant the risk can be. And finally, what you're going to do. Okay? So I have finished off this part. Thank you very much. So all the best. And happy studying. And we shall move to the next video that will look at the governance structure of risk management. And once we finish that, we can then move into the IT aspects of the syllabus. Okay, thank you. Goodbye.